and welcome to this week's episode of the Good Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, this afternoon we're carrying on our world tour, I suppose, for want of a better word, of whisky, and again using samples that were entered for the 2015 World Whisky Awards. So you might think this is a bit of an odd one. I mean, yes, these are all blended whiskies, and you think, well, what have these two got in common? Why are you doing them both together? I mean, on the surface, they're completely different. One, obviously, the James Sedgwick Distillery is a distillery in South Africa. The Black Mountain Whisky Company doesn't own a distillery and is technically a bottling company that can be found in the Armagnac region in France. And you're thinking, there's no link between them. And I suppose the links are slightly tenuous, but there's enough of a link between the two for me to do an episode of the show on them. And first and foremost, the main protagonists behind the two projects, shall we say, are inherently passionate about whisky. They have been doing it for a little while. I mean, certainly with regards to the James Sedgwick Distillery anyway, and they both have won numerous awards, although I believe the James Sedgwick Distillery again has probably won more awards, but they both won awards for what they produce. They both produce blended whisky, although as you probably know, the James Sedgwick Distillery does produce a single malt, but today we're just looking at the blends that they produce. And interestingly enough, both produce blended whisky that has been imported from Scotland. So, okay, like I said, the links between them are fairly tenuous, but they are links nevertheless. So I think they're going to work quite nicely together. And yeah, we shall see how these kind of stack up against each other. So a little bit of information about each of these two particular bottling companies. Like I said, the James Sedgwick Distillery is a distillery, obviously, which can be found near Wellington, I believe, in just outside of Cape Town. It was founded in 1886 by a sailor, a captain, James Sedgwick, who was a captain for the East India Company, and obviously sailed that particular area, and like a lot of these sort of captains and sort of high up members of the East India Company forged trading links, all that kind of stuff, not necessarily for the company itself, but anyway, that's history, ancient history, and we're not really talking about that today. But anyway, so after he obviously sort of resigned his commission, I guess, for want of a better word, he sort of set up his own company to, as it says here, in 1859, a purveyor of quality liquor, tobacco and cigars. Now, I do apologise if I keep looking to my right, but my printer ran out of ink and I haven't had a chance to print out my notes for this afternoon, so I'm having to look at the laptop. So hopefully that doesn't annoy you too much. So basically, so he kind of set up this company in 1859, which eventually led to the creation of the James Sedgwick Distillery in 1886, which was actually built by his two sons, as he himself died in 1872. So they built the distillery, and although I don't know exactly what the distillery is producing, I believe it was just producing brandy. And I mean, as you probably know, South Africa is quite renowned for its brandy production. So it kind of probably sort of went on its own merry little way, and until the point gets to the point where we're really interested in, when it became a fully fledged whisky distillery, which was in 1991. And they brought on board a chap called Andy Watts, who was at that time working for the Stellenbosch Farmers Winery as a blender, and he basically sounds like quite an interesting life. And initially was a professional cricketer and played cricket for Derbyshire, just up the road or down the road, as the case may be. And he then obviously he did some time working for Morrison Bamore, met some of the sort of like, you know, the well-known members of the whisky fraternity, and learnt how to sort of, you know, distill whiskey. And obviously so you learned quite a lot from people like Jim McEwen and so on and so forth. And then when the Stellenbosch Farmers Winery decided, well, I guess they eventually became Distell, decided to move this brand that they had called the Three Ships to that particular distillery, and Andy came in, and it was his job to produce the blend. Basically they had a bit of a refit. I'm imagining probably in the 90s, although I think the major refit was in 2009 when two new pot stills were commissioned, shaped similarly to Bamore's stills apparently. Anyway, so the distillery itself has both pot and column stills. The malted barley they tend to use is mostly imported from Scotland, although the grain that they produce is mostly local maize, so quite interesting. And I'm guessing at the time that this Three Ships blend that was being produced by Distell was probably just, you know, a bought blend from, or was made from, blended whiskey that had been bought from Scotland and was just being bottled under their label. I believe now it has slightly changed. I think that they use some of their own produced spirit in the blend as well, as so it's effectively a bit like the Amrut Fusion, whereas it's a blend of, you know, Scottish malt and grain, along with South African malt and grain. And in actual fact, one of the bottlings we'll be looking at, one of the blends, is actually 100% their own produce. So I think that could be quite interesting to see, you know, the difference between the two. So that's kind of the James Sedgwick Distillery. Like I said, it's won numerous awards, including Best Blended Whisky in 2012, Best Grain Whisky in 2013, Best International Whisky Distillery at the New York Spirits Competition in November 2015, and Andy Watts was named Whisky Magazine's Global Icons Rest of the World Best Master Distiller, Master Blender in 2016. That's a bloody mouthful, isn't it? Try saying that after a few. But anyway, so I've tasted, you know, the Three Ships on numerous occasions, and, you know, certainly what they're producing is exceptionally good. However, the first time I actually did taste their single malt, or the first release of their single malt in the UK, I really was looking forward to it. I thought, great, you know, let's see what South African whiskey tastes like, and it was a big sherry monster, and I was really disappointed, because it was just like some of the European whiskies, not the European whiskies, the Australian whiskies. It was a case of all I can taste is sherry, and I want to know what South African whiskey tastes like. It's got to have something going for it, you know. Unfortunately, subsequent bottlings of the Three Ships 10-year-old have been aged primarily in American oak, so you do get more of that kind of character. So as you can see from the three samples that we have here today, they are all American oak aged, so purity of spirit time, I think. Anyway, so moving on to the Black Mountain Whisky Company. Like I said, they are not a distillery. They don't own a distillery, although they have plans in the pipeline for a distillery. And as I think it was Cedric Laperette, who was one of the four sort of members of the group, shall we say, that put the company together, told me, being sort of relative novices of this, it's probably taken them a little bit longer than they would have hoped for, getting through all the sort of legal work and what have you. But anyway, so the company itself was founded in 2011, like I said, by a group of friends, four friends: Cedric Laperette, Pierre Lepetit, Laurie Morin Segonnet, and Jacques Rossi. hopefully I've pronounced your names marginally well. I think I'm probably a bit more comfortable with French names than I am with German. But anyway, so basically they buy blended whisky in bulk from somewhere in Scotland. Obviously he's not letting on exactly where, and interestingly enough, this is something I didn't actually realise, that apparently they can't buy single malts in bulk. Apparently that was outlawed in 2012, so they're kind of, you know, all they can do is buy blends, but I guess there's a fair whole amount of that knocking around. So so basically they have the use of warehousing in an Armagnac distillery, which, although Sedgwick didn't say exactly which one it is, I think is called the Distillery de Lascaux de Barts, I think, owned by a chap called Stefan, who's allowed them to use some of their warehousing, and they also use his ex-Armagnac casks for finishing, for want of a better word, but we'll obviously, when we get to the individual whiskies, we'll talk about them. So it's interesting. It's kind of a bit of a twist on the whole blend thing, and hopefully the sort of like, you know, the Armagnac cask will give some, you know, Armagnac-y kind of element to it. So we'll see what those taste like when we actually get to them. I did ask the question because I wondered whether they owned the distillery, which obviously they don't, and I wondered whether they actually, you know, had a go at sort of using a mash of malted barley and passing it through the Armagnac stills, and I imagine that it was a "Mon Dieu! You what? You want to put mash of malted barley through my Armagnac stills?" Sorry, I probably sounded very un-French there, but you kind of get the impression. You know, I don't want to sully my Armagnac stills with your mash of malted barley, but apparently Stefan is looking at purchasing or having a whisky still built, so there's a possibility he may well be making whisky before the other guys get their distillery going, but who knows. Anyway, so that's basically about it. One of the interesting things is that, from what Sedgwick was saying, is that he's really interested, probably more so I would guess, in the art of maturation, which is why they're using the Armagnac casks, and they're doing at the moment an interesting experiment with a cask of Black Mountain No. 2, which is currently, well, sailing around somewhere. I should have probably looked up where, but in an old, as he said, British boat, which kind of like, you know, not a little rowing boat, called the Greyhound Lugger. So, and that's kind of interesting as well from another point of view, because it's not unheard of for seaborne maturation. I mean, if you think about it, and this is kind of going off on a little bit of a tangent, but Madeira, for example, was originally, that's how it came into being, in the fact that casks of Madeira wine were transported from the island through the Mediterranean to the UK, and during that time on board, the heat made it sort of, you know, quite prematurely oxidise, and the salt, and created what we know as Madeira today. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this particular cask kind of matures with all that sort of movement and the sloshing around, and is it going to sort of take on more oak character? Are you going to get more kind of oxidation character from, you know, the distinct changes in temperatures? Obviously you're going to get some salty character, and I'm hoping that Sedgwick is going to be kind enough to send me a sample when it is indeed bottled, because I think that would be quite interesting to see. But so there you have, that's a little bit of waffle and information about two distilleries. You can find out more online. Both companies have websites, so if you want to do so, then you know where to go and have a look. So I'm feeling a little bit parched after all that talking, so I think it's time to taste some whiskey. Right, okay, so before we actually taste some whiskey, I probably better tell you what exactly we are going to be tasting. So we're going to kick off with the two bottlings from the Black Mountain Whisky Company. First one is BM No. 1, which is bottled at 42%. This is, like I said, a bought-in blend. It's back through. It has a 3-year-old age statement, and I'm guessing it gets tankered in. They then fill it into. I'm guessing first fill Armagnac casks, where this particular blend spends 12 months in those casks. Then, interestingly enough, they then take that whiskey. They then add 25% of a 9-year-old blend to it, which has a slightly higher malt content, and then put it back into second and third fill Armagnac casks for a further 6 months or so. So, could be quite interesting, and probably I should have tasted that one, well, should taste it after I do BM2, because BM2, Black Mountain 2, the second bottling, which I'm probably going to taste first in actual fact, is a slightly more simplistic version of BM number 1, in that it's the same blended whiskey, but it essentially spends about 6 months, or a minimum of 6 months, in American oak. So before we go any further, I'm going to switch the two over. Right, then we're going to go and we're going to have a look at the James Sedgwick blends. So the first one we're going to be looking at is Three Ships Premium Select, bottled at 43%. Like I said, this is a blend of both Scottish malt and grain, and I'm guessing South African malt and grain. I'm not entirely sure of what the component part of each is, but it's a blend of those. So, and it spends a minimum of 3 years in ex-American oak. The next bottling we'll be looking at is the Three Ships Premium Select 5-year-old, again bottled at 43%, exactly the same concept but a little bit older. And finally we'll be looking at the Three Ships Bourbon cask finish. Again, bottled at 43%. This is produced from 100% malt and grain from the distillery itself. So you know, this is the real McCoy, so to speak, with regards to South African whiskey. It spends 3 years in American oak, and then a further 6 months in first fill Bourbon, hence why it's called Bourbon finish. I did kind of wonder about that. But so yeah, there you go. That's this afternoon's little lineup. So let's kick off with BM number 2 then, shall we? Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us then, shall we? It does have a youthfulness to it. I mean, I can certainly see that this blend is no older than 5. It's got a nice pleasant floral note to it. Yes, there's a lot of grain, but it's quite floral grain. It's young. There's a touch of barley, a little bit of honey. It's got a touch of weight to it, and there is sat in the background. There is some wood notes. It's not sort of particularly sort of creamy and vanilla-y. There's maybe a little bit of dried fruit, a little bit of tannin. I mean, certainly that tannin is kind of giving it a little bit of pleasant structure. And I don't think this is retails for, you know, huge amounts of money. So let's put it this way: I've nosed a lot worse, shall we say? So yeah, I like this. This is pleasant. This is, you know, nice aromatic floral, touch of barley. Yeah, it's a good blend. Let's see what the palate's like. That is nicer in the mouth, actually. It feels weightier in the mouth. Feels like slightly more heavier malt content. I'm certainly getting some slightly sort of tight, grainy, tannic notes coming through on the middle, but there's a touch of treacle. There's certainly some lovely dried sort of dark fruits right on the finish. Good length, you know, slightly mouth-watering. It's just about the right ABV. It's kind of easygoing. It's pleasant. And yeah, it has a bit of a twist in the tail. I mean, I must admit, I think when I tasted this completely blind, I had no idea this has been finished in ex-Armagnac cask, because that sort of dried fruit could kind of lead you in a sort of a sherry, but then there's none of the sort of like the Oloroso-y notes or anything like that. Or so I mean, it did. I remember thinking this could possibly be wine cask finished of some form or description, yeah, I think that's a uncomplicated and, you know, pleasant blend, I think. Okay, so let's have a look at BM number 1. Let's see how this differs then, shall we? Well, straight off the bat, you can smell it has a bigger malt content. It's denser, weightier, heavier. There's a little bit more honey. There's a touch of coffee. Again, it's got a nice florally kind of note to the grain component. It's soft. It's got, again, a little bit of tannin, a little bit of that sort of Armagnac-y oak, the sort of slightly tighter sort of French oak notes in the background. It certainly doesn't have the sort of voluptuous American oak vanillins. Yeah, it's got a bit of a verve, it's got a, you know, an edge to it, but without being sort of, you know, industrially edgy, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think this is actually a very nice blend. Let's see what the palate like. Fuller, sweeter, richer, more cocoa-y, a little bit of treacle, more malt, touch of floral grain kind of coming through on the end with a smidge of citrus. Again, there's that dried sort of Armagnac-y notes. Certainly, they're coming in more on the mid palate, sort of late mid palate, before it sort of like, you know, freshens up right on the finish. I think it's going to be really interesting when, you know, with regards to the cask that's been doing the rounds out at sea, so to speak, because I think a sort of touch of saltiness will probably come through quite nicely on the finish and kind of, you know, kind of balance up the richness and the slight treacly notes. So yeah, again, I think that's a pleasant blend. It's certainly absolutely nothing wrong with that whatsoever, and like I said, not particularly expensive. So so yeah, good stuff. Incidentally, he says this particular blend did win the I think it was the best European blended whiskey in the 2015 World Whisky Awards. So so yeah, it was good stuff. Right, okay, so let's move on to the first of the 3 ships bottlings. Let's see what this gives us then. Lighter, certainly more space-idey in character. It's got that sort of perfumed white fruit, some perfumed sort of almost sort of appley blossom kind of honey. A lovely freshness. There's a touch of granulated sugar, apricot. That is a lovely blend. Certainly getting a good dollop of American oak character. Not overly creamy, nicely vanillaed, and again quite broad. But it's working really nicely. You're getting the aromatic character, you're getting the fruit, you're getting the oak, and again, it's not a particularly expensive bottle, as far as I don't think it is anyway. Yeah, that's a lovely whiskey, really nice. Let's see what the palates are. Softer, creamier oak up front, a little bit of estery, sort of banana-y kind of notes. certainly feels more like a 3-year-old on the palate, as it does kind of like, it is a little bit short, and there's a little bit of kind of sort of oak tan. Yeah, there's a bit of oak tannin. Again, but it's wonderfully smooth. It's a bit drying. I don't think you'd wanted to bottle that at 46% because that would have emphasised the sort of the drying finish and probably shortened it even more. So I think sort of 43 is the ideal ABV for that. It's pleasant. It's again, it's. I think the nose for me is more interesting than the palate, but it's certainly well put together. There's no harshness, no off notes. So yeah, I think as a blend that works really nicely. Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this. This is the 5-year-old. Obviously there's some peat at work here. Reasonably peated. It's got some nice smokiness to it. There's also, but underneath that it's got, again, a lovely sort of weighty, fruity malt. Again, sort of in that sort of Speyside-y kind of style. White fruit, apricot. But yeah, that's the smoke is kind of just sort of like the peat smoke has kind of added sort of and obviously another dimension to this whiskey. There's obviously a touch more, almost kind of charred oak. It's a little bit fuller, but again, it feels like quite a relatively heavily malt content blend. It turned out to be the other way around, but it's certainly sort of doing its best impersonation of a sort of well, 50 or 60% malt blend. I mean, yes, that you can smell the grain. Again, it's got that sort of slight sort of perfumed sort of, well, not perfume, wrong word, sort of aromatic, sort of floral kind of character. Yeah, maybe there is a touch of perfume there, a touch of perfume, almost kind of perfumed white flowers. And after a while the peat sort of starts to kind of dampen down, and you certainly get more of the actual spirit character, but once you give it a bit more aeration, out comes the peat again. So yeah, this is definitely an entertaining blend, it has to be said. So let's see what the palate's like. Full, rich, slightly treacly, honeyed, a bit more robust on the palate. Peat kind of comes through on the finish with a little bit of a medicinal note, nothing too sort of too much. There's a touch of licorice and a little bit of almost kind of camphory kind of notes. A little bit longer. I think the sort of like the peat is obviously adding another dimension to this blend, and again, it's really pleasant. It's well put together. It's soft. It's round. It's got a relative level of complexity to it, and so yeah, I can see the attraction of it. Yeah, I think it's a lovely whiskey. Right. Okay. So finally, we are on to the Bourbon cask finishes. So this is all South African malting grain. Let's see what the nose gives us. That's lovely. Big, juicy, estery. I'm getting sort of a little bit of pineapple, banana, lychee. Absolutely gorgeous. And that, like I said, I remember when I tasted the malt, the Three Ships 10-year-old, which was aged in American oak, it just blew me away. And they also did I think a limited edition version as well, I think, which I tasted at some point, and just absolutely stunning. And it just goes to show that they are producing some absolutely top class malt and grain at the distillery. It's just really well balanced. There's that light sort of, again, slightly florally grainy note kind of coming through, but it's a touch more American oak. You certainly get the sort of buttery first fill Bourbon cask notes kind of coming through. A little bit of toast as well. Oh, that is absolutely fabulous. And I'll tell you what, I mean, again, it feels pretty heavy on the malt. Certainly on the nose, you're certainly getting more of the malt up front, and the grain is kind of playing second fiddle, sitting in the back, doing what grain whiskey should do in a good blend, I think. So, that is absolutely fantastic. Let's see what the palate's like. Quite a lot of the American oak on the palate. I'm definitely getting charred oak, vanilla, a little bit of sort of cocoa powder right on the finish. It's a little bit more sort of oak centric, shall we say, on the palate, although again there's that lovely sort of slightly estery, pineapple-y, sort of apricot-y fruit kind of coming through, certainly on the mid palate. Grain kind of coming through right on the finish, with again a little bit more sort of austerity, a little bit more crispness, and it's kind of working in really nicely with the charred oak character. I mean, the oak seems to be the constant theme. I can't teeth falling out. The oak is the constant theme here on the palate, and it's really nice that you've got sort of the malt and the grain kind of dancing around it, shall we say. So you've kind of got the oak is this sort of like almost like sort of like the meridian point, I suppose, and then you get the malt and the grain kind of like just working through that, and I think that is a lovely blend, really nice. So again, hats off to Andy and the distillery, I think. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. So, two brilliant sets of whiskies, I think. Certainly, I think Sedgwick and Company are obviously sourcing some quality blended whiskey from Scotland, and certainly it's just really drinkable, really nice. And I think it would be interesting when they eventually do get their own distillery up and running. I would love to know what they're kind of going to be up to, shall we say. But I mean, yeah, there are distilleries in France. I've tasted sort of several of them, and I think the thing is that as long as they don't kind of rush the spirit out, get it to 3 years old and go, right, we've got to bottle it, I think, you know, as long as they kind of like say, right, well, we'll bottle it when it's ready to be bottled. And I suppose the fact is they can keep doing the blended, they can keep buying the blend in, and that will obviously give them the revenue stream which they've obviously got, so they're not kind of like going to be rushing into having to get their own single malt out and onto the market before it should be. So I think that will be really interesting. I'd like to see what else they kind of got planned, whether they're going to be sort of doing some, you know, using some wine casks. I mean, certainly, you know, they're going to be able to get hold of, you know, all sorts of different wine casks. They're in the right place for it, shall we say. So I think that would be quite interesting to see a few blends maybe finished in, say, ex-Grenache casks, for example, or Pinot or something of that kind of ilk. So, and maybe they're kind of working on that. So I think they've got, you know, lots of scope for trying different things. I mean, certainly, like I said, Sedgwick seems to be very much into the whole maturation process, which is why they're doing this thing with, you know, the cask on the high seas, so to speak. So I wouldn't be surprised if they are trying out a few different wine casks. Probably some will work, some won't, but I guess we'll find out in due course. And the James Sedgwick Distillery, well, I think it just goes to show that certainly with their own produced blend, the quality of what the distillery is producing is just absolutely spot on, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be at the end of the day. Obviously, Andy has had the experience and certainly knows what he's doing. So again, and it's just interesting, the two sort of, you know, the blending of both the sort of Scottish and the sort of South African malt and grain, I think is again really nice. and their own product as well as and so it's kind of a unique, what's the term, USP, I think they call it. So using kind of like those kind of terminologies, and I must admit, I mean, you know, when originally encountered the Three Ships malt, it was being distributed in the UK. I don't know who's distributing it now, but certainly it was just the malt rather than the blends that were being distributed in the UK. Yeah, I think really very, very good stuff. So if you can you know, track some down, I would certainly recommend doing so. Right, anyway, so that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope I've done both distilleries, well, both companies, I should say, justice. I think they're both really, really interesting, and I think, like I said, I think you should sort of like have a look into them, track them down. They're not very expensive whatsoever, so it's not like you're going to be forking out sort of mega bucks for experimental whiskey, shall we say. So, yeah. All I have to say is good afternoon and good ramming.